ready to unleash our inner artists. Today, we're diving into the world of acrylics. We're tackling brushes.
Such a fundamental tool.
I know, right?
Yeah,
And I have to admit, just talking about this makes me want to run to the art supply store.
I get that. New brushes make everything more exciting.
Totally. But it can also be a little overwhelming.
You're not wrong.
I mean, we've got all these articles here. Brush types, techniques. Where do we even start?
It can definitely feel like a lot, especially if you're new to acrylics.
Exactly. Like, how many brushes do I really need?
Right. Flats, rounds, filberts, fans, liners, the list goes on.
And each one has like a million different sizes.
Yeah.
It's intimidating.
I think the good news is you don't need every single brush to create amazing art.
Okay, that's reassuring.
And what I really liked about what we read is the focus on understanding why each brush type exists.
Oh, I like that. So it's more about using the right tool for the job rather than just collecting brushes.
Exactly.
So like if I'm laying down a wash of color for a sky, I'd probably reach for a flat brush.
Exactly. And speaking of washes, they are so important in acrylic painting.
Yeah, I always think of them as the first step, like laying down those initial washes of color.
Absolutely. It's the foundation. And it's amazing how even within that one technique, there's so much variation.
Totally, like a diluted wash versus a thicker wash. They create such different effects. And then if you factor in the canvas texture,
It's like you said, it's all about understanding how the tools and the techniques interact.
my mind is already blown. And we haven't even touched on fan brushes yet.
So many possibilities with just that one basic technique.
And when you start layering colors on top,
It adds a whole other level of depth and richness.
it's like with those sunset paintings. You've got those subtle transitions from yellows to oranges.
Exactly. Each layer interacts with the ones beneath it, and it creates this almost luminous quality.
It's amazing what you can achieve with just a few layers of paint. But it does sound like it requires patience.
Patience and observation are key, but that drying time, don't rush it.
Oh,
It's actually an opportunity. You can create some really cool effects by working with partially dry layers.
interesting. So it's like you're playing with time as much as you are with the paint itself.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another fascinating technique, glazing.
Glazing. Okay, that one sounded a bit intimidating at first, I have to admit.
The name does sound a bit technical, but essentially it's about using thin, translucent layers of color to modify the layers beneath.
So instead of completely covering up what's underneath, you're letting it peek through.
Exactly. It's like adding a veil of color.
I'm starting to see how this technique could be used to create some really subtle and nuanced effects.
You can use it to create a soft glow in a portrait or deepen the shadows in a landscape. It's incredibly versatile.
And our sources mention using a glazing medium. Is that what makes the paint translucent?
Precisely. The glazing medium thins out the paint and makes it more transparent.
So we've got these smooth washes, subtle layering, and now translucent glazing. It's amazing how many different effects you can achieve with acrylics.
It really is. And we haven't even talked about dry brushing yet.
Oh, right. Dry brushing. Now that's a technique that seems completely counterintuitive. Using a dry brush, doesn't that ruin the canvas?
You'd think so, but it's actually a really cool technique for creating texture.
Okay, I have to know more. How does it work exactly?
So you load your brush with a tiny amount of paint,
Like barely any paint on there.
barely any, and then you wipe most of it off onto a paper towel.
Okay, so the brush is almost dry.
Almost. And when you drag that nearly dry brush across the canvas, it creates these really interesting broken lines.
So it's less about the color and more about the way the paint interacts with the canvas texture.
You got it.
It's like you're creating these little peaks and valleys of paint.
Exactly. And if you use a textured canvas, it just adds another layer of interest to the final piece.
Makes sense. So we've covered washes, layering, glazing, and dry brushing. But what about dabbing? Our source material talks about that too.
Oh yeah, dabbing is great for creating a more playful textured effect.
Yeah, it sounds kind of fun.
Yeah.
Like something even I could handle.
It's very approachable. Basically, you're just using a light bouncing motion with your brush to create texture.
Like imagine creating a field of flowers. Each dab is like a little burst of color.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can use different brushes to get different effects. A fan brush will give you a softer look, while a round brush will be more concentrated.
Our source material actually recommends experimenting with different tools for this, like even using a sponge or a crumpled up cloth.
I love that. Don't be afraid to think outside the box.
This is making me realize that all of these techniques can be combined in so many different ways.
Absolutely. It's like learning a new language. Once you have the basics down, you can start experimenting and creating your own unique style.
Speaking of which, our sources also included some project ideas using these techniques. Abstract compositions, textured landscapes, Floral studies.
So many possibilities. Where do you want to start?
Honestly,
Yep.
I'm kind of drawn to those textured landscapes,
Yeah,
especially if you're talking about dry brushing.
me too. It would be amazing to experiment with layering those earthy tones and using dry brushing to create the texture of tree bark and leaves.
Oh, maybe incorporate a wash for the background to give it that atmospheric look.
And some dabbing to create a field of wildflowers in the foreground.
This is so inspiring. I'm already picturing it.
That's what we love to hear. And remember, the most important thing is to just have fun and let your creativity guide you.
It's been amazing to dive into the world of acrylics and explore all these different brush techniques. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. And remember, even though we covered a lot today, this is just the beginning. There's always more to explore and learn.
And who knows, maybe we'll even inspire some of our listeners to try out these techniques themselves.
I hope so. There's nothing quite like creating something beautiful with your own two hands.
That's a great note to end on. So as you embark on your own acrylic painting journey, remember, don't be afraid to experiment, find your own style, and most importantly, have fun. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of acrylics.